Va en contramano, Rosario, para allá.
Ajá. A ver, Piqui, corta.
Hello everyone and welcome back. Today we will build a system around a very special socket 939 chipset, the ATI Radeon Express 200 Crossfire. The motherboard differs slightly from the standard layout that positions the RAM right to the CPU. The CPU is still centered, but slightly offset to the right, with the 24-pin power connector and the 8-pin power connector to the right, providing almost the ideal positioning for a very clean case build. The 4 slots for the DDR1 memory are positioned to the left of the CPU, a layout that personally I haven't seen since the days of Socket 7. South of the memory slots, we can find the 16X PCI Express and a 1X PCI Express, and another PCI Express slot that is able to go to 8X when using 2 graphics cards. Under there are another 3 standard PCI slots for extension boards. There are 8 serial ATA connectors for plenty of hard drive, some of which offer RAID possibility, and north of them there are the classic floppy and 2 IDE connectors. In the backplate area there are the PS2 connectors, keyboard and mouse, some digital audio connectors, 6 USBs, 2 Ethernet and 1 Firewire connector. The manual details using 2 graphics cards in Crossfire mode, but since the motherboard was released in 2005, it shows 2 X850Xs that have a different type of Crossfire connector positioned outside of the case on the cable. This instruction is not going to be very helpful since our cards have the Crossfire connector on the inside. We're going to start with the CPU, the Opteron 185, offering 2 cores and being almost the equivalent of the fastest CPU available for 939, without the unlocked multiplier. The memory modules are next, and since the engineer behind the famous 939 DFI LanParty motherboards and the previously Socket A 8-bit motherboards, Oscar Wu, found a way to run all 4 memory modules at 1T command rate, we're going to try just that. Next we have the graphics cards. Launched in 2006, this is the X1950 Pro, the Gecube version, that's basically a PCB sandwich between a copper radiator and a copper backplate. The graphic card outputs to 2 DVIs and also has an S-Video. The upper left area of the graphics card has 2 Crossfire connectors that will provide internal connectivity between 2 or more graphics cards. For storage, we're going to use Western Digital's 150GB Velociraptor, and we're going to make it double. And now we assemble everything. We start with the CPU, and you should always be aware that there's an arrow that aligns the CPU with the socket. Since this is almost the fastest CPU for Socket 939, we're going to show it proper respect and use the Thermalright 120 Ultra, but for this we have to disassemble the existing bracket. Overall I worried that maybe 2 screws between the bracket and the radiator were not enough, but all the tests proved me wrong. And since I was aware of the odd memory slots placement, I put the memory modules first, before adding the fan. Next we're going to add the power supply unit connectors and the serial ATA connectors. We start with the graphics cards, and I'm extra careful since the first card is so close to the CPU radiator. The second card is much easier to fit, and once the power connectors are fitted, I also add the Crossfire connectors. You should be aware that both Crossfire connectors are required, otherwise you're going to get a warning from the driver and you will not be able to enable Crossfire. The assembly was easy enough, but powering the system was way more difficult, and I'm forced to slowly downscale the parts so I can get it working. And I start by replacing all the RAM with 2 memory modules that I know to be functional. Before powering it on, I also forgot to add the audio module. but since no tests were done at this point, there was no impact of it missing. Not pictured here is a whole week of downscaling process, down to an Athlon 64 3000 plus with just 1 DIMM of RAM, no hard drives, and an S3 on one of the PCI slots, so it has come to that. A debug card was showing me the F2 error code. You can see it here at 0.8, so I updated the BIOS to the latest version, being confident I upscaled it all back to the full 4 memory modules and 2 graphics cards, only to be faced with the same F2 error. At this point I ran out of debug ideas. The only part left unchanged since the start of the project was the power supply unit. And yes, I've even gave up on the thermal right, as it was really troublesome to replace the CPU and dismantle almost everything. The power supply unit I've been using for the projects on this channel was the Corsair TX750 that had served me well since almost 2012, and I never questioned its integrity. I had a backup power supply unit, a 620 watt Seasonic, that I was reluctant to use since it would lower the total power available, but I had to try to change it as well. To my surprise, when powering on the system with the new power supply unit, everything booted just fine on the first try. I went back to the Corsair with a tester, and the -12 voltage was a bit low, and to my surprise the 5 volt was jumping from 5 to 4.9. This doesn't happen for any other power supply unit that I have, so I guess the Corsair is off limits until I fix it. So after almost 2 weeks of hardware issues, I finally managed to install Windows XP. And the feeling that the drivers will keep me for another 2 weeks proved unfounded, as the first driver I tried, the 712, worked like a charm. Surprisingly, the second driver I tried for the Crossfire, the 10.2, didn't create any issues either. I installed it to see if the Crossfire X provided by the 10.2, as opposed to just Crossfire provided by 7.12, offers any additional configurations or extra points in the benchmarks, or if it corrects the issues with microstutters that will plague the rest of the clip. The benchmark results encouraged me to stay on 7.12, and also the microstutters didn't see much improvement, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. Of course, I'm not going to disappoint the people that expect Radeon driver issues, but the only issue I've encountered was reverting back to 7.12 from 10.2. In the meantime, I've also used other Radeon cards, and I've installed 10.2 several times. To do this successfully, after using ATI Software Uninstall utility, I've used Driver Cleaner Pro to remove all ATI software, and then Windows Installer Cleanup for the ATI software. Apart from this hiccup, the drivers were solid. And when I say solid, I mean really stubborn in offering any other resolution from the smaller classic 4x3 and larger wide 16x9. The X1950 Pro Crossfire tests were also done by other people back in 2006, and I was kind of hoping to compare the results, and this is why I needed 1600 by 1200. That although my capture card could display, the driver refused to provide. But there's a way around this, by getting the file path from the driver and following it into the depths of the registry, where you will find the DAL non-standard modes 8CD1, and we can add our own custom resolution. After the restart, the resolution could be found in the selectable dropdown. But after the drivers, I've encountered stubborn games that refused the resolution or just didn't show it, so I couldn't make the comparison for all the games using 1600 by 1200, so I decided to stick with the closest wide resolution of 1680 by 1050. The capture card I started this project with refused 1600 by 1200 altogether, so I had to resort to a very cheap USB 2.0 that really surprised me by being able to output every resolution I threw at it through the HDCP cable. But the cheapness came with the cost of latency, and we're going to talk about that a bit later. Since we're on the subject of modifying the driver, ATI Radeon cards were known for the high temperatures they operate. To my surprise, during the tests, I never found the X1950 Pro to be hot, which I attributed to the copper sandwich that holds the PCB, but that was only half of the solution, as the distribution of fan rotation to core temperature was really well done for the X1950 Pro in the driver. Since I also don't want to disappoint people coming here for the overheating hardware, especially Radeons, one other graphics card that will be present in this clip as a competitor for the Crossfire is the X1950 XTX that is prone to overheating. We will be using the HIS version that also has a copper radiator but no backplate. On paper, the XTX doubles the specifications of a single Pro, but it also doubles the price, and overheat it did. Quite badly actually, and by looking at the driver configuration, the fan had an awful curve that would only go to 25% at 77 degrees centigrade, and it would only hit over 50% rotation speed at 83 degrees centigrade. You can put a stop to the overheating issue by manually forcing the rotation at 75% speed, and the temperature will drop in the low 50 centigrade. Since we're doubling on everything for this clip, I felt like a lost opportunity not to have a RAID 0 made out of two of Western Digital's Velociraptors. And off to the BIOS we go to create the RAID and set the stripe size to 512K. Then we go to Windows and have a look at ATTO and HDTune. I'm pretty happy with the transfer speeds for a 2005-2006 computer, but by the looks of the histogram in HDTune, the RAID controller isn't able to make the most of the hard drives, as mechanical hard drives start with the high transfer rate and slowly lose it as the test progresses. In this case, the controller is bottlenecking the transfer rate, but at least we have 7 milliseconds as access time. Before we switch to the games and benchmarks, we go one last time to the BIOS to see the configuration for the Crossfire. After we enable the dual slot configuration, we can set the first graphics card to have a bandwidth of 16x, with the second one to have a bandwidth of 12x. But in reality, both of them will function at 8x. In Windows, we need to go to the driver and enable the Crossfire, and we're all set to start the benchmarks. One last thing we do is go through the information for the system in CPU-Z. GPU-Z also helps us with some information about the graphics card, and we can select an individual card for information about the frequencies or about the temperatures. We can see that in order to synchronize the cards, the driver has one of the cards running at lower frequencies than the other. And we start with Prey from 2006 that is built on Doom 3's engine. Since for all of the benchmarks we're going to look at the Crossfire and single X1950 Pro and the 1950 XTX, we're going to split it into two charts so we don't clutter the screen. We can see the Crossfire with the red lines, and the greens are for the X1950 XTX. We can see the two choices being really close for the lower resolutions and the gap widening in favor of the Crossfire as more pixels need pushing onto the screen. For the Crossfire versus single card, there's no competition, with the Crossfire sometimes doubling the score of a single card, but in the lower resolutions, a single card is really close to the Crossfire. Why is the Crossfire not able to push more frames in the lower resolutions like it's able to do in the higher ones? From what I've read on various forums, it's a matter of synchronizing the two cards. The issue will also be present for other games in lower resolutions, but it will also be present in high resolution if the game is optimized and it is able to push over 60 frames per second, so it's mostly dependent on the frames per second rather than the resolution. The actual frame loss in the lower resolutions can be attributed to microstuttering. When this happens, the image seems to freeze for a fraction of a second, and this is confirmed by Afterburner that drops the 1% lows into the 2 frames per second. At this point, some of you may be wondering what happened to the RAM and running 4 memory modules at 1 command rate, since the initial hardware issues were solved by replacing the power supply unit. I actually completed the tests with both configurations of 2 and 4 modules, and while I was really excited to run 4 modules at one command rate, apparently I didn't read the second statement in the manual. They can be ran at a maximum frequency of 333 MHz. Mine started by default at 266, and here are the results of benchmarking Prey with both sets. You can see why this was an easy choice to continue with just 2 memory modules for a total of 1 GB of RAM, but running at 400 MHz. Doom 3 is next, and by the issues I had enabling anti-alias and also accessing higher resolutions when benchmarking this game, I can definitely say that the engine was more polished by the time it reached Prey 2 years later. The graphs of the Crossfire vs XTX and the Crossfire vs single card are pretty similar to what we've seen in Prey, and also the microstutters are still here. Quake 4 is the last game with the Doom 3 engine we look at today, and it's no different from the other two in terms of benchmark results, but I can say that the microstuttering looks worse here compared with the other two games. I mean, it's probably worse on Doom 3, but it being so dark, we can't see it so much. Both Doom 3 and Prey are marked as being able to take advantage of the Crossfire technology, so I guess Quake 4 is also able, but all the games suffer in lower resolutions from microstuttering, and only when running the games in high resolution with anti-alias and anisotropic filter we can get a decent experience. The Crossfire has the same issue we've encountered in Doom 3 with the anti-alias. It looks like it hits a barrier, and no matter the resolution, the frames per second are similar. Somehow the XTX confirms this and behaves exactly the same, and only when anti-alias and anisotropic are enabled we can see a normal descending curve with the resolution. Quake 4 was also the only game where the single XTX was also microstuttering. Far Cry never implemented support for Crossfire, and the single charts are again a bit odd, where the smaller resolutions have about the same frames per second, while the larger resolutions have similar scores. Similar to Quake, I was expecting the XTX to have a similar curve, but it had to be different. In this case, the XTX picks up the speed, and contrary to common sense, it delivers higher frame rates as the resolution increases. But the anisotropic curve kind of looks normal. I have to let you know that for the odd results, I usually come back to the tests and check the settings and rerun the tests. Sometimes I even switch the drivers. In Far Cry, I've encountered an odd benchmark issue where the frames per second drop to 2 frames after jumping with the glider from the cliff. Otherwise, I would say that the Crossfire experience is pretty smooth, even in lower resolutions, and there was no noticeable microstuttering. Crysis was the first game that made me think that I have picked an underpowered processor, but brushing that aside, because I needed the 939 platform to evaluate the very first chipset that allowed for Crossfire, I gave it medium settings that in some places felt a little too much, and I only tested it without anti-alias or anisotropic, as it barely hit 30 frames per second in the lower resolutions. Fear is next, and we finally have a normal chart with the Crossfire and the XTX battling at every resolution. Only one test for the X1950 Pro showed an odd behavior, where it was able to beat the Crossfire in the 1280 by 1024 resolution. Did I say that Fear was the only game with a normal behavior? I got a bit ahead of myself, and actually Fear created some very interesting configuration issues. When running the single X1950 Pro, I usually disable the Crossfire from the drivers, but there were moments when I could find the Crossfire enabled, so I was forced to go to the BIOS for disabling the second graphics card. Well, at least I'm happy with the Crossfire LanParty, because I don't need to move all those headers to another position just to disable the second card, like I would do for the SLI LanParty. Battlefield 2 is great. I really don't have anything to complain other than the higher number of frames per second. And while for both the 1950 Pro and the XTX, the chart descends as we increase the resolution, the Crossfire looks like it hits a ceiling. Also, the XTX descends a bit slower than expected, with the resolutions, and it may very well be a frame rate cap we hit here. The game does not support Crossfire directly, but it looks like somehow it is able to take advantage of the second graphics card for the higher resolutions. The first game where I can say that I'm really proud of the results is Half-Life 2: The Lost Coast, where the Pro knows its place, but the XTX really battles it out with the Crossfire down to the last breath. The configurations of Half-Life 2 also offer the possibility of multi-core rendering, a lonely option among the games we're going to see today. X3 Reunion also has a great chart, and again we witness a fierce battle between the Crossfire and the XTX. This is the only game benchmark where we can't access the 800 by 600 resolution. Splinter Cell Chaos Theory is one of those games that offers the choice of the shader model. Since the X1950 offered the shader model free, we're gonna go with that. And we start as usual with the Crossfire versus the single X1950 Pro, and here the chart is as smooth as can be, with the lines almost parallel while decreasing when going to higher resolutions. Switching to the Crossfire versus XTX, it looks like the single XTX card yields almost a 25% better score in shader model free than the Crossfire. But we can't let go the opportunity to test other shader models as well. And in red we have the charts for the Crossfire, while in green we have the charts for the XTX. We already knew that the XTX has a better score for shader model free, but when it comes to shader model 1.1 or shader model 2, the Crossfire is better. I also have to report that I haven't seen any slowdowns or microstutters in Splinter Cell. We're moving to Company of Heroes, that also has a built-in benchmark, and we are also going to start a game, a competition between the Crossfire and the XTX. Can you spot the Crossfire? If you picked the upper footage for the Crossfire, then you've made the right choice. The demo shows a bit of microstutter and lots of tearing. The charts look good, with a nice clean slope. There's no surprise in the Crossfire versus single 1950 Pro. And the XTX is a detached winner in Company of Heroes. We're looking at another wargame, World in Conflict, a masterpiece, often overlooked, that also has a built-in benchmark engine. Since it's a bit more modern, we will use the medium preset, and by the looks of it, the anti-aliasing and the anisotropic filter take a heavy toll on the Crossfire. The Crossfire versus XTX chart shows the Crossfire edging just a little bit over the XTX, with a better result for the XTX when using anisotropic and anti-aliasing in 1920 by 1080. The next game we look at is again a bit more modern than the usual retro stuff we look at. It's called Lost Planet, and Capcom have implemented support for the Crossfire in this game, so I was very excited to see the comparison. The Crossfire versus single card chart is pretty straightforward, and I was expecting a bit more than just 30 to 35% difference for a game that explicitly supports Crossfire. While comparing it to the XTX, the Crossfire is marginally better. Now it's time again for the Can You Spot the Crossfire game. But this time we're going to make it a bit more difficult by using different resolutions, and due to my negligence, the lower screen doesn't have full scaling. Also, the game engine plays a bit of a trick on us. When it detects a 512 MB graphics card, it shows additional insects, and I could see this behavior throughout the resolutions. So by now it is clear that the lower screen is the XTX, and if you picked the upper screen for the Crossfire because of the artifacting and the stutters, then you would have picked correctly. There is an honorable mention for the Crossfire that the stutters and the artifacts are not present in 1920 by 1080, hence I picked the lower resolution footage for the comparison. Devil May Cry 4 is another entry by Capcom, and just 2 years later they got their Crossfire engine in order, and we can see a 75% to almost 100% increase in frame rate from the single card to the Crossfire. Just not when using anti-alias or anisotropic filter, which sometimes is worse than a single card, but a valiant effort indeed for their Crossfire engine. The XTX also takes some punishment from the Crossfire, but bounces back with the anti-aliasing and anisotropic filter results. I forgot to mention that Devil May Cry 4 benchmarks include 4 scenes, and I've made the average for these charts. Still, while the frame rate drastically increased for the Crossfire, unfortunately the artifacts and the tearing specific to the Crossfire can be observed throughout the benchmark. For Stalker Call of Pripyat, I've used the benchmark program that only completes the benchmark when the renderer had static lighting, and since the game crashed whenever I used any modifiers like anti-alias, we'll only see the simple charts. The high score for the Single X 1950 Pro is explained by the appearance of the microstutters for both the Crossfire and the XTX that, like with the other games, go away with the higher resolutions. And now we leave behind the benchmarks and move into the games section, and we start with 2005's Need for Speed Most Wanted, a game that doesn't support Crossfire. On the left we have the Single X 1950 Pro, and on the right we have the Crossfire. Now we smoothly translate to the XTX that's only missing 2 or 3 frames per second to match the pace of the Crossfire. While the driving style looks like it's inspired by Jackie Chan's Drunken Master movie, I have to show you the capture cards I've used for this clip. We start with AverMedia's internal card that has an HDMI input, and I was able to use an HDCP cable, but the quality was not great, and also the smaller resolutions like the BIOS or the BIOS for the onboard RAID were terrible. The second one is a budget-oriented USB 2.0 capture card that did its job rather well, no matter the resolution, but introduced a hefty lag, and it is the master responsible for teaching me the art of driving under the influence of considerable lag. The last one is my current capture card, but it arrived far too late to capture anything for this clip. Let's move on with the games, and now we're looking at 2006's Company of Heroes. We can see the frame rate somewhere in the mid-20s. That's actually half the amount returned by the benchmark for this resolution and preset. But I wouldn't recommend playing the game like this. Maybe decrease it to a maximum of 1680 by 1050 and use a medium preset. Next we're looking at another game from 2006, Prey, built on the Doom 3 engine. Regarding the microstutters that we've seen throughout the benchmark, the actual gameplay looks far better, and except for some tearing, the game plays rather smoothly, with the engine delivering a constant 60 frames per second.
away from me! Go to hell, you bastard!
2007's Bioshock is a little too much for the Crossfire, at least at 1920 by 1080 resolution, and we need to lower it, and also the graphics settings.
Don't be fooled. She's a little sister now. Somebody went and turned a sweet baby girl into a monster. Whatever you thought about right and wrong on the surface, well, that don't count for much down in Rapture. Those little sisters, they carry Adam, the genetic material that keeps the wheels of Rapture turning. Everybody wants it, everybody needs it.
Being really confident after the benchmark, and knowing that Capcom implemented support for the Crossfire, I started Lost Planet Colonies in high hopes, a bit too enthusiastic about the resolutions, anti-alias, and anisotropic filter. I moved back to settings to correct these issues by lowering everything, but the rather busy scene didn't help that much. I would call this frame rate barely playable. Moving. 2007's World in Conflict in 1680 by 1050, and except some artifacts in the map area, the game delivers a decent frame rate for a real-time strategy, and there are no other inconveniences.
Cap entrance cleared. We are ready to move on, Lieutenant.
Sokol 1 to Romanov. The first AAM placement is located to the east. Move swiftly.
Go, go. Enter moving. Enemy scout helicopter spotted. We're staying out of sight. In transit, neutralize. Clear. Moving. Go. In transit. Alpha.
Grid is a game from 2008 where my driving technique, coupled with the low frame rates and some interesting artifacts, deliver a final blow to trying to play racing games on this rig.
Right now, Gianni Marcello is leading the race.
Next we move to the benchmarks and we start with 3D Mark 2001 that is mostly pointless due to its non-support of the Crossfire. But it's a tradition for a retro channel, and we can also witness the raw power of the Crossfire versus the Single X 1950 Pro. And it's only 1000 points for a score of over 30,000, which is rather disappointing, but at least the XTX is not that far off. Also, the Crossfire picks up the pace in the higher resolutions. I'm not sure that 3D Mark 2003 has support for Crossfire, but the score speaks for itself, and we can see a big difference for the Crossfire versus the single card. There's also a considerable difference for the Crossfire versus the XTX. When it comes to 3D Mark 2005, the Crossfire versus the single card difference is almost 40% throughout the resolutions. The Crossfire also keeps up the score when compared with the XTX. It's time again to spot the Crossfire in the following clip. If by this point you haven't picked the clip on the right, it's either YouTube compressing the quality out of the clip, or you got bored with so many benchmarks and left the window running. The last benchmark we look at today is 3D Mark 2006, that pretty much shows the same thing as the other 3D marks. But unlike the other benchmarks, it offers a score for Shader Model 3 and Shader Model 2, and we're going to throw these numbers in as well, and look surprised that the Crossfire is better in Shader Model 3 than the XTX, unlike what we've seen in the charts for Splinter Cell. Before the conclusions, we have one final round of spotting the Crossfire, and considering the length of this clip, I made this one easy to pick. Apparently the Shader Model 3, with 6 samples anti-alias and anisotropic set to 16x, was too much for the Crossfire in the 1920 by 1080 resolution. So after all these tests, opting for a Crossfire doesn't look like a solution for people that just want to build a retro rig and enjoy some retro games. Personally, knowing how computer gaming changed around mid-2000s, with more online games and people playing competitively, I think that many people expected the Crossfire to provide more frames than a single card, which it does. But the issue of microstutters in the lower resolutions takes away the enjoyment, and I can't really say that I've seen a big improvement with the later drivers. Still, there are some benefits of building a Crossfire like this one. Driving it hard with high resolutions and anti-alias and anisotropic filtering seems to have its benefits over a single GPU solution that was more than double the price. So playing single-player campaigns in high resolutions is the way to go for a system like this. If you got bored with so many numbers in charts, there's a shorter conclusion for the Crossfire tests we did.
Conga, 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 las chicas bailan conga. ¡Esa! A ver, Rosalía, el pasito.
¡Eh! Ajá,
Va en contramano, Rosalia, para allá.
ajá. A ver, Piqui, goza.
Now that you probably have a good idea of what the Crossfire is capable of, and whether you like to build this kind of system or not, we can look at the single GPU solutions in order to make a proper recommendation for people trying to build a late retro system using the X1950 graphics card. There's another graphics card, the X1950 GT, a budget successor of the Pro. It's a good thing it had the sticker on the back, because GPU-Z identifies it as a Pro minus 100 MHz to the RAM. As you can see in GPU-Z, almost identical to the Pro, and on the sensor side, the GT is lacking any form of monitoring. The build quality of the free graphics card speaks for itself, with the GT having just an aluminum radiator. Again, a Crossfire solution is possible, and it also has a Molex connector for additional power. This is the only card having a VGA connectors, the other two have two DVIs. Gecube's card has a copper radiator and a copper backplate, allowing it to survive mechanical abuse or negligence because of good heat dissipation. This is the only card I didn't clean before this clip, as I felt the temperatures were pretty good. The XTX has the turbine form factor, taking 2 slots, that personally I'm not a very big fan of. What surprises me is that it has only one 6-pin power connector, just like the Pro. And there's no backplate on the back. But all in all, I know that his is an excellent partner for ATI, producing some of the most sought after cards. Given the operating temperatures, I was lucky to find this card in such a good shape, and I personally know the previous owner, and he did a great job taking care of it. Looking at the specs, we can note the X1950 XTX as being the first card where the memory got to 1 GHz, and its DDR4, which was not present in their 2900 lineup. Also, it has double the memory of the other two, and leaving it to the driver's defaults, probably double the temperature. When it came to sound, the turbine was the noisiest, followed by the Pro, where the fan would rattle a bit, but mostly because I didn't do any maintenance on it. If I would have cleaned it before, it would probably be as silent as the GT or more. Finally, when it comes to power consumption, I have a graph showing the peak power consumption in 3D Mark 2001 and 2003 for all the cards, Crossfire included. Oddly, the X1950 Pro has the lower power consumption, although I would have expected the GT, that's basically the same configuration, with a lower frequency for the RAM. Looking at the high-end solutions, we can see that the Crossfire is a bit more thirsty than the XTX, and it's about the same percent that sometimes we can see in the benchmark results. And I didn't cover too much during the conclusions for the Crossfire. Here's a graph showing idle and peak power consumption for the Crossfire and the single X1950 Pro card. In the first column the Crossfire is enabled, but if we want to get rid of the microstutters and run the game with just one card in the lower resolutions, what is the better way to disable the Crossfire? In the second column the Crossfire is disabled by unchecking the checkbox in the driver. In the third column the Crossfire is disabled from the BIOS. And in the final column the Crossfire is disabled by physically pulling out the second card from the system. While power consumption wise the last method is the preferred one, I would advise against it, as sometimes fixing both of the Crossfire connectors in place is a pain. And yes, you need to have both flexible band connectors in place, otherwise the Crossfire cannot be enabled. Finally, because I plan to look into a similar motherboard with SLI, I got the scores for the 7900 GTX running on this Radeon chipset motherboard, and I plan to compare them with those from an Enforce 4 motherboard just to make sure that there's no funny business. And here are the results with the 7900 GTX having the white line and the X1950 GT and the Pro being almost identical. In the end there was a clear winner today. The single X1950 Pro card from Gecube stands out from the crowd as being a sandwich of PCB between copper radiator and copper backplate, surviving temperature, and any other form of mechanical abuse the years have thrown over it. Also in terms of performance per dollar, being 25 to 33% in most of the tests under the XTX, while being less than half of the price of the XTX, it was also a better choice back then. Right now the prices vary a lot, but if you are lucky to find a cheap XTX, just be aware of the temperatures it must have seen over the years. Since it was $140 at launch, the GT has a better value, but I can't fully recommend as mine had two leaky capacitors that needed replacing, and when it comes to retro, for me, reliability is the most important factor. Thank you for watching and see you next time.